So we are now moving to Canada, to our last speaker. We are going to be hearing from Felicia Rembrandt. She is a founder of Gender Dissent, a Canadian feminist news website dedicated to exposing the power, influence, and money driving the gender industry in Canada. Prior to starting this website, Felicia explored various feminist positions on her personal WordPress, which is a sledge and a crowbar. But because of transactivism and reading about it in Feminist Current, she became politically active, and now she's going to tell us about this project of hers. So welcome, and over to you.
I would like to start by talking a little bit about myself, because I think that I am representative of women in Canada who are fighting against the intrusions of gender ideology. Unlike many of the women that I have seen in previous Feminist Question Times, I have not been a lifelong feminist activist. And I find myself doing things now, taking political actions that I've never done before in my life, and that I never really imagined myself doing. I've always been aware of feminism. I knew all my adult life that I was riding a wave created just before me by second wave feminists. I expected to be able to attend any university, to get any kind of a job, to enter any profession. And because I was a woman at that very specific time in the 70s, I was able to do those things. All kinds of companies were on the lookout for women to hire. Over the years, I have kept an eye out on the feminist movement and on issues related to women, but I got on with my own life. I was teaching young adults for many years in the 90s, and because of that, I did see that feminism was out of fashion. My young female students were often opposed to it or just indifferent. They were, even more than I, living a kind of life that had been won for them by second wave feminists, and they didn't see any external limitations placed on them. So I said, I think that my situation is representative. In Canada, we're seeing two broad cohorts, younger women under, say, 40, and then older women like myself who are often grandmothers. And yet we have lived for 30 or 40 years without visible external limitations. When I quit working about 6 years ago, I started a blog. I was traveling in Europe at the time, and all the little hotels I stayed in had a small shelf of books. I was on my own. It was winter. I had long evenings to fill. Even in Paris, night falls early in winter. So I started writing feminist analyses of the books I was reading. I kept it up after I got home and wrote a fair number of analyses of magazine articles in addition to books. I like to read some American magazines of ideas, and there's a Canadian one as well that I was reading. And it's easy to write feminist criticism of magazine articles because they are still almost all written by men from a masculine point of view that pretends that that point of view is universally human. I would recommend that anybody who wants to develop their feminist chops do that sort of thing themselves. Look at how men present their point of view as universal. I would also say the conversation is by men to men. As women, we're allowed to look on, but I think men are talking to themselves. So while I was writing this blog, I was also looking hard for other feminist blogs to subscribe to. It was not easy. Eventually, I found Feminist Current, which is Megan Murphy's site. You've probably heard of her. And I started reading madly from there. Shortly after I started, she announced that she'd been examining the issue of trans ideology and had decided it was a bad idea, and she was coming out as opposed. I didn't have much to say about it, since I knew nothing about it, that issue. I didn't even know it was a thing, and I didn't know any trans people either. But Feminist Current began running more articles by or about trans women. So I was getting an education, and I saw pretty early on that it was crazy. I then joined a local feminist group, Women's Space Vancouver, which had just started up in response to a kerfuffle about Megan Murphy speaking at a library here. So I was able to join that group. And as a result of that, I heard about SOGI 123 in BC schools. SOGI is sexual orientation and gender identity. They mush them together and pretend they're all one thing. And it was pervasive in BC K to 12 schools. So I thought that I would like to write something about it for the feminist group that I was part of. By that time, I had joined Twitter, and I frequently saw posts by Jennifer Billick. So I did what seemed to me a terribly bold thing, something I would never have contemplated, and I direct messaged Jennifer to ask if she knew about any links between Arcus, the so-called philanthropic foundation in the US, and the ARC Foundation, which had created and was disseminating SOGI 123. She replied almost immediately with lots of links for me to look at, and said she was trying to start an international follow the money website and would I like to join. So that's what started it all, my new life as a political activist. And that started what would become the feminist news website, Gender Dissent. Jennifer suggested that if I could find a few other people to join me, we could participate in some international Zoom meetings that she was having with British women. So I sent out in whatever way I could a request for anybody who might be interested in joining me. A member of the Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights Organization, that's COSBAR, answered me, and she found a number of other COSBAR members who expressed an interest. So we ended up with about half a dozen women scattered across the country and started having weekly Zoom meetings. And we joined Jennifer's international Zoom meetings with the British and the Irish. Now, the Canadian political context for all of this that I've just described started for me in 2015. And in 2015, we had a federal election. After about 8 years of conservative government, the Liberals won. They were headed by a young, photogenic son of a previous Liberal prime minister. He had very little political experience, but the Liberals were pretty desperate to find someone who would appeal to voters. Very shortly after taking office, he brought in Bill C-16. That is the name of a bill that added gender identity and gender expression to the Human Rights Code and made some provisions for them to be included in the category of hate crimes in criminal legislation. No one had voted for this. It was not on the Liberal platform. Our farther left-wing party, the New Democrats, had been trying to get such a bill passed for years, but they were unsuccessful while we had a Conservative Party in power. Justin Trudeau allowed the NDP to put this forward as a private member's bill. Usually private members' bills from opposition parties go nowhere, but under Trudeau's leadership, this one passed. And it remains a question, if he was so proud of this, why did he allow a minor member of the opposition to put this bill forward? So in 2017, Jody Wilson-Raybould, then Minister of Justice, who is a member of two marginalized groups, she's a woman and she's Indigenous, was chosen to be the puppet front for a bill that would destroy women's rights. Canada also has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is a separate thing. It was created in the 1980s by Trudeau's father, former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and sex remains a protected characteristic there, and gender identity has not been added to that. But despite the Charter, within 4 years, from 2017 until now, the government has redefined woman. On government websites, including the Justice Department page, it defines woman as anyone who claims to be one. Statistics Canada lists crimes by males who call themselves women as women's crimes. Newspapers follow suit. We now have men in women's prisons, in domestic violence shelters, and in sports. Children are being indoctrinated, and the government is spending millions to deepen that indoctrination. We believe the Charter is being violated. Bill C-16 has been used as a platform for self-ID, even though, or maybe because it doesn't define its terms. I should say that just yesterday, a Canadian activist who calls himself Just Dad 7 published a post containing the results of his research into how self-ID has come to be the way that things are in Canada. And it's not particularly because of Bill C-16. It happened bit by bit in the provinces through the human rights organizations. One man who calls himself a woman at a time going to court to claim discrimination. It just takes one man, whether he calls himself a man or whether he calls himself a woman. Once the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code were changed, policies across the federal government started changing. Notably, the federal agency formerly called Status of Women was renamed to Women and Gender Equality Canada, or WAGE, in 2018. And here's what they say on their website. Women and Gender Equality Canada works to advance equality with respect to sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity or expression through the inclusion of people of all genders, including women, in Canada's economic, social, and political life. I'll just repeat that. Through the inclusion of people of all genders, including women. So we are no longer a sex category. We are one of multiple genders. So that was the context that was unfolding as half a dozen of us were meeting weekly to talk about starting up an international news website. Some of us started writing articles in anticipation. But by August, that's this past August, Jennifer Billick had decided that the international website wasn't feasible. For the moment, she didn't have an alternative plan. But we had articles ready to be published, and we suddenly had a new election on the horizon. So we decided to start our own. And thanks to one of our members, Blue Jay, we had that site up and running in 3 weeks flat. And Blue Jay, I might say, had no prior web building experience. Another of our members with design experience, Tanya, created our logo, and we were up with 7 to 10 days to spare before the election. Now I would like to show our website. There is our logo. Gender Dissent, exposing the money, power, and influence behind the gender industry in Canada. We have sections on government power and influence. We have sections on financial power and influence, and we have a resistance column. But here I would just like to show you the first 2 articles written again by Blue Jay about the Canadian parliamentary system. We wanted people to be able to read this information before they voted in the election last September. And I would draw your attention to that picture. That is Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, holding Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Minister of Justice. Have you ever seen such an image in the world of politics? This is not a picture of the leader of a country and one of his most important ministers. This is some really weird shit, I think. That is our Twitter account. We try to post 2 new articles every 2 weeks, and divided into investigative journalism and the resistance column. There is so much to investigate because all of this has been accomplished in stealth, little bit by little bit. But the news is so bad that I believe we need to give Canadians hope and help them to see that we don't have to simply lie down and take it. We can resist. We are resisting. So we find examples of that and we publish. And we hope that that may inspire other women and male allies to engage in their own acts of resistance. And we're always soliciting more people to write for us. So just a little pitch, if there is anybody there who would, out there in the audience, who would like to write for us, give us a shout. Women's voices are being ignored and silenced. We have a national public broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcast Company, or CBC, which only runs stories favorable to men who call themselves women. The sort of sob stories that paint them as harmless victims of something, I'm not sure, victims of gender. Online, the CBC gives their platform to men who have proclaimed that they were actually women somehow a mere year ago, and they block women's replies. The rest of the media is almost as bad. I would like to conclude by saying that since 2016, there has been a resurgence of feminism as a movement in Canada. Numerous women's groups have sprung up: COSBAR, Women Matter Canada, We the Females, Alberta Rad Femmes, Women's Space Vancouver. Those are just some of them, the ones that I can think of right now. Plus, young women are starting journalism careers to advocate for women's rights. I'm thinking of April Haley, Anna Slatz, and our own Eva Kurilova. I'm not sure that this could have happened without the development of a platform like Zoom. We're such a big country and we're spread out all over the place. We have only a few large cities. To really launch a war against gender ideology, we need to connect with women from all provinces and territories. And most of those groups are filled with women without long histories of feminist activism. Some would not even define themselves as feminists, but just as gender critical. We're mostly newbies, and we're having to find our way from scratch. I think this feminist movement of the 21st century will be different from those that came before. Women are united by a new appreciation of how important it is that we're recognized as a sex class, which includes a recognition of the importance of biology. We're stressing the importance of women's role as givers of life, in contrast to the second wave, which was stressing the other roles that women could aspire to. And I am surprised to see sometimes the importance that's given to the fact that women give birth. This was not something that was going on in the 70s, when women gave birth all the time. And what we were trying to stress, or the feminists just before me were trying to stress, was that women could do other things as well. Our opponents are a different kind of man. They're not the old-fashioned patronizing misogynists coddled by wives and daughters of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are disaffected men, often bitter men who have been abandoned by women, they think. They're incels, they're porn-soaked men. They're men whose lives have been, they believe, diminished by women refusing to live their lives for them. They're men who believe that if a man denies his manhood, he deserves what they think of as the perks of womanhood, which is primarily the right to be objectified. This class of men is a harsher opponent. And what we're discovering, all of us, sometimes to our great despair, is that despite our entries into the public realm, the status of women has not changed nearly as much as we thought. Some of us are having to overcome our shock to find the contempt that we're held in and our inability to be heard. Gender Dissent is a place for our voices to be exercised loudly.